we recently scanned babies from families who either made less than the poverty line, which is, that's really poor, actually, our federal poverty line, or up to 4 times the poverty line, which is comfortable. We scanned them when they were 1 month old, and again, MRI scan when they were 2 years old. Strangely, the 1 month was much easier. They just slept. The 2 years, trying to get them from wiggling around, anyway. And then we said, okay, what in these babies' environments predicts how much their hippocampus grows? Interestingly, it wasn't finances per se, or food insecurity, or any kind of material measure like that. Doesn't mean those things aren't important for other things, but if we're just talking about the hippocampus here, not a big deal. It wasn't cognitive stimulation. It wasn't being read to, and books and toys to teach letters and numbers. It was 2 things. One, interestingly enough, following up on the Raj Chetty findings, location, location, and location, right? It's neighborhood. We looked at their census tracts and saw how many people are unemployed, other measures of neighborhood deprivation. And as young as 2 years old, that is impeding hippocampal development. And the other thing, which I think is going to connect to some things that Lee will talk about, and actually we haven't talked in advance, so I don't know, but this you could go in this direction too, if it's social capital. The maternal behaviors towards the child. Is the mother so stressed out, so depressed, that she isn't really responsive and sort of helping buffer all of the environmental stress for the kid? That also turns out to make a big difference.
So let me ask, Lee and Angel, let me ask you, it seems to me we have been thinking about poverty for so long, and in some ways have made progress, and in other ways have not.
Yeah.
When you think about this idea of looking at poverty through the lens of neuroscience, not as neuroscientists, right? What do you find to be the most promising aspect of that? What do you think the neuroscience lens could help us address and understand?
So for me, and I'll preface this by saying, actually, part of how I really got interested in this work was my early work at Children's, taking care of teenage parents and their babies, and taking care of families who often were in very difficult circumstances, but really seeing many of them thrive. And so it's trying to think about, so why is that, and what can we do? So that's the case for more families. And so what is most interesting to me about the neuroscience is the capacity to buffer the effects of poverty through things that I can do in my clinic, through things that we can do in our community centers and our child care centers, and really sort of flipping the lens. Clearly, the best thing to do is eliminate these stresses, right? And we don't want to lose our focus on that. But what's really, I think, exciting about this neuroscience is that there is an ability to buffer some of these changes through intervention. You alluded to this. One of the most important things is relationships, right? Strong, loving relationships with consistent caregivers, be it parents or child care providers or community members, can really mitigate these brain changes and mitigate the impacts of poverty. And so for me, I think that's actually one of the most exciting pieces.
Angel?
Yeah, I think that for me, one of the exciting pieces is that we can shift our hyper-individualist culture from a sense of individual blame, that somehow the young people that are, as they're growing up and they're challenged in classes, challenged in learning, challenged in the way that they show up in the world, even up to violence. And of course, their ability to concentrate, all the things that we know that impact them are not just because they're bad kids. It's not just because they're, intending to be that way. And I think that helps us to begin to think differently about the the society's responsibility for how it is people are growing up. That it isn't just about like, well, you pull your bootstraps together and then take care of yourself and you'll be okay. So I think that's one of the things that's exciting. I also think it can be used against people, and there's a flip side of it as well. And I just want to say that there was some point at which you were talking about the mothers being responsive, and I want to say just a little adjustment, ability to be responsive, because you're under that kind of stress. That's not a choice also, right? That's not the mother's choice, is like, I'm not going to be responsive, but rather I'm under so much stress, it's difficult to be responsive, even to know what being responsive is. If you're just trying to keep the harsh neighborhood out of your house, just keep food on the table, just keep the children, in the most basic way safe. But I'm shocked by the young age. And on the other hand, which is interesting because I hadn't thought about it at all because I don't know the science. As a meditator and practitioner, the same regions that you talked about are in fact the same regions. And so when I just think about myself and my own experience and how my practice and my own health has been affected by the choice to have a spiritual path, that then makes sense to me why I have made different choices. And same thing, I grew up in housing in New York that is in Tribeca, New York. And my mother had low income access to that housing, but it meant that I had incredible social capital because I grew up with people that spoke different languages. There's a sense of, I was right on the river. There was a sense of like possibility and hopefulness. I didn't grow up in the kind of poverty-stricken places. And as you say that, I'm thinking like and I've always thought that to myself, that made a significant difference in who I am in the world based on maybe the statistics of who I could have been had I not grown up in the place that I did.
Well, and just to add one really quick thing, I think your point about not every mother or caregiver having the full capacity to provide that care is really important. But I think the other really important piece of that is that a lot of those skills are coachable, right? And actually some of our work God, we're talking about this, some of our work, we're actually teaching mindfulness and having mindfulness seminars for low-income families in a child care center. And it is really remarkable, the impacts that we're having. We actually done a child care center. There was also some pilots done at our homeless shelter. First of all, the receptivity to that was tremendous. Yeah. But also the impacts on the parent-child relationship. It's early, but it's really remarkable. And I think it really speaks to the fact that these are very coachable skills. We can't assume that it's never going to happen, but that there's really these important skills to teach.
I'm glad you mentioned the flip side, because it was actually my next question, which is, it seems to me this area has enormous promise, but it's also one in which there is some political peril and political sensitivities as well. I mean, the history of treating poverty as something that the poor are different from the rich, right? And you then get into not only that, but you get into some combination of genetics and medicine and all that is a very dark history, which it would be terrible if we took that history and said, we're not going to study human beings because of that history. But it also seems like we really shouldn't talk about this without engaging fully in that. So can you talk a little bit more about the flip side and what aspect of this idea of studying brain functions in particular you think we should be wary about, and what parts we should kind of embrace?
Yeah, well, I think that, first there's the most immediate problem of objectifying human beings into scientific, lab rats that can be studied and something can be predicted about them because, as we know, human beings are incredibly resilient and can go beyond. I was being interviewed a few weeks ago, and it was a Canadian fellow, and I was talking about my life, and in the sort of field I'm in, I'm somewhat known, and so I think he had an idea of who I was, but as I talked to him in this interview, he got the background of my history. I've been abused and like lots of things, and then he just paused at some point, and he said, how did you become who you are? Right? And so there's that sense of like, on the other hand, right, if you have these conditions, that perhaps we then get this writing off feeling, right? And also that we come in with an idea of we know what to do for people now also, right? That communities don't have the answers for themselves if they are not, if they're not given the right conditions, they can actually figure out what they need for themselves. That we all have histories and practices that are true to us, that I think our culture and society that delineates us and values us differently based on our race and our gender and our backgrounds and our histories has robbed from us as peoples. And so I wouldn't want those aspects to become like, and now we're going to make everybody something that can be like fixed, but from the outside, rather than recognizing the resilience of communities and their capacity and the necessity of people being able to actually adhere to a strength of their own cultural and their own understanding and their own capacity to know what they need for their communities for them to thrive.
Martha, obviously doing this research, you've thought a lot about the sensitive questions, the sort of the places you do and don't want to go, engaging with criticism of this kind of work. How do you think about, is there any part of this work that you sort of feel like, I actually don't want to go there? Or do you kind of want to go anywhere? And how do you grapple with this whole question of the sensitivities around it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel, maybe this is my, scientist part speaking, but I feel like the truth shall set you free.
Yeah.
And if we're open-minded and we are compassionate and all the rest, let's find out. Let's find out the way it all works. I will say that...
Those are two big ifs, I just want to say that.
It's good to be optimistic.
True. But here's the thing. I mean, this sort of dichotomy between viewing a human person as a person with, maybe a spiritual life, with maybe free will. I mean, whatever the vocabulary is that you want to apply, on the one hand, and viewing them as a really fancy computer walking around with legs and an arm and a face that can show expressions and stuff, right? These are, to me, impossible to reconcile. And I don't think, thousands of years of philosophy has tried to reconcile them. I'm not optimistic about that being reconciled anytime soon. But I do think, you do the best you can with the mysteries of this life. And I think that for certain purposes, this objectification, which sounds like a negative way to put it, but I think it can be helpful. Think as an example about society's view of depression and what it was like and what it is now like to be somebody who struggles with major depression. It was, for many years regarded as a character weakness. Talk about bootstraps. Just get yourself together. And as our understanding of depression as a biological phenomenon developed, the world has come to see it as, certainly having that spiritual, psychological side, but also having a fairly complete, coherent explanation as a biological phenomenon. And I think there's no doubt that has reduced stigma for depression, and incidentally has led to some treatments for it. And I think, maybe with poverty too, we can reduce the stigma. I mean, surveys show that some frighteningly large percentage of American citizens think that poor people are poor because they are lazy, they make bad choices, they have kids that they can't support, and all the rest, right? Well, one nice thing about reframing this in a more mechanistic biological framework is neurons aren't good or bad, guilty or praiseworthy, right? Neurons just do what neurons do. A brain growing up in a certain environment, it would have to violate the laws of physics and science, right, to develop differently. So I do think we have to move back and forth between this more humanistic view of humans with a subjective mental life and responsibilities and free will and all the rest, and this more mechanistic view. But I do think the mechanistic view can have really positive, compassionate effects.
Lee, as a clinician, how do you think about, let's imagine a world in which, as Martha said at the beginning, we're in the very, very early stages of learning about the neuroscience of many, many things, including the neuroscience of poverty. Let's imagine that the next decade brought one breakthrough after another. As a clinician, how do you think it would help the treatment of children if we knew vastly more about the brain functioning of poverty?
Well, I think it would help tremendously, first of all. And I think of it almost as personalized medicine, right? I mean, we think of personalized medicine in other ways, but this would really allow us to personalize care and intervention at the community level, at that humanistic level, right? It would allow us to personalize intervention for families in that place. And I think that, we know a lot. We're learning now still, right? But we still do know a lot. But a lot of what we don't know is what works in what situation and for whom does it work? I mean, I often think, our field so much wants to sort of package interventions. They want to have a curriculum that you say, if you're having X problem, you can participate in X curriculum and that's going to help. Well, I think, if I was struggling with parenting issues or behavior issues with my child, I don't want someone to come to me and say, well, I've got a group session that you can go to at 3 o'clock every Tuesday afternoon. I want personalized attention, and developing a greater depth of knowledge about the neurobiology will allow us to do that, but will also allow our field to move forward in that area, to really start moving beyond the packaging of this work to really thinking about, so for this particular child and family, what are the collection of services, what are the collection of supports that is going to be best for them and involving them in that decision, and in providing input into that.
One more question for me, then we're going to open up to you all. So a couple of us have mentioned this Equality of Opportunity project led by Raj Chetty at Stanford.
Yeah.
What really makes this different than anything else is just the scale of the data they have. In the past, if we wanted to follow people's paths, right, the census goes out and asks people questions every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does it, but they don't track the same people. And so for actually a lot of the questions we care about, that's a problem, because we want to know, do people go from poverty to the middle class to wealthy, and are the snapshots we're getting, is it always the same people who are poor?
Right.
What the Chetty group got is they got access, with the names removed, to millions and millions and millions of tax records. To exaggerate only slightly, they got access to all of our tax records with our names removed, which allows for research that is really of an unbelievable scale. It allowed them to do things like this. Look at families that moved from the kind of zip code where it is really hard to overcome the odds to a much better zip code. And compare the kids in the same family, one of whom moved at age 4, and the other of whom, a sibling, moved at age 8. And what were their outcomes like in life? That's sort of a dream, right? Because the 4-year-old and the 8-year-old, think about all the things you've just controlled for, right? Parents, you name it, all these things. And what they found, and I actually found this to be a deeply encouraging finding, is that a lot of these effects were linear, which is this whole sort of movement we have had of if you don't treat the kids and help the kids by the time they're 2, it's all over, was wrong. Yes, it's much better to take a kid out of a bad neighborhood into a good neighborhood when they're 2 than when they're 10. But they're not lost when they're 10. So that was all a long lead up, I apologize. But does the early research on the neuroscience of poverty consistent with that? Or do we see, is it less optimistic in a way, and do we see sort of cliffs in which if we haven't reached kids by one age, we can't really reach them so well? Martha.
I will say the answer is unknown. one of the reasons it's unknown is that's the kind of question that, as you say, you need longitudinal data, right, to follow. Well, NIH, longest grant you can get is 5 years, right, and then you have to renew again, and it's a crapshoot. So yeah, we don't have that kind of data specifically on poverty and the effects of interventions. But here's what I will say, just general neuroscience background knowledge. The brain is the most plastic, the most changeable in response to the environment at younger ages, very consistent with this finding from Moving to Opportunity. That's the younger kids benefit more. But plasticity, there is not a person in this room whose brain is too old to be plastic, okay? We are all capable, given the right environment. So, right, cheer up, there's always hope. That's what I tell myself. There's always hope of, sort of rewiring and benefiting. And in particular, in terms of early life trajectories, there's increasing evidence now that adolescence represents a sort of second peak in plasticity. Also, in the sort of mad scientist department, there's a neurobiologist at Harvard, Takao Hench, who's doing amazing work, mainly with animal models, but now a little bit with humans as well, opening and closing sensitive periods, that is, boosting and reducing plasticity. So who knows? I mean, our great-grandchildren may be able to go to the doctor and say, you know what, I had a really difficult experience when I was 12, so can you sort of design me a little therapy and then give me that drug that increases my, who knows? That's the mad scientist department.
Let me open up to all of you. No, go ahead, please.
Quickly, for me, I'm not at all, I think, yes, the truth will set us free, and I'm not opposed at all to the science itself. I think, though, as a society, one of the things we have to remember is that we have had an amazing historic ability to reframe information differently depending on what group of people it is. And so I'm more concerned, it was like about those ifs, right? If we're compassionate, if we're kind, if we're receptive to the idea, but if on the other hand, our society remains in a place in which for lack of a better way of saying it, it has some investment in certain communities, particularly African-American communities, as not being seen as having the same capacity for resilience and capacity for shifting, then we will warp that as well. So there's the science, but there's also how do we then interpret that science in such a way? Nothing in our society gets interpreted in a neutral way. I believe the scientists do and the clinicians do, but once you take it into a political and economic lens, then you are no longer dealing with neutral information. And so I think that's where my concern lies.
Well, and if I could just add briefly to that, I do think that it's a really important point, and that there's huge responsibility to this. And actually, one of the things that was so interesting to me when we started to do our work in DC, which is predominantly African-American community, we, as a part of our leadership team, we have several community leaders who run organizations, grassroots organizations, and one of them in particular, whose father was a civil rights activist and has really been very involved and invested in the Washington, D.C. community, he was very touched and moved, actually, by the science. And he said what was so compelling to him was that what he said, it doesn't matter what your race is or your background, it's these exposures have the same impacts on your brain, no matter who you are, where you came from, or what your race or ethnicity or religion is. And so I think you're exactly right. We have to be very careful, but I think there is also an element of empowerment that comes with that, where we can say, you were not bad, right? Like this is these same changes to the brain happen to any child. And so there's an element of empowerment there too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you.
I think we'll get a microphone coming to you. Please identify yourself and keep the questions short.
Hi, I'm Amanda. Terrific panel. Thank you so much. I want to pick up on your point about how structural inequality gets reproduced in every new system that we generate unless we're really thoughtful about it. And I wonder what you think we could, I don't mean me personally, we as a group of people who are interested in this kind of question could do now at the beginning of this field to take the idea that poverty is a social phenomenon that has biological effects and use that as a way of not just treating the biological, but as a way to feed it back into a political and individual mandate to change culture.
Yeah.
Love that question.
Well, I just want to say it's also historical,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's probably, I was in a panel earlier and talking about it's one of our special gifts in the country is that we tend to be enormously ahistorical and acontextual. And so, and those things they're very dangerous, right? Our lack of ability to acknowledge our history and not only the poverty in the current moment of people, but people's historical poverty and the impulse or the overwhelming compulsion to keep people in poverty generation after generation is serious and significant. And I think it's not just that there's structural inequality, there is political inequality that is part of that. And so it's really like not just being thoughtful, right, but really, I think a very broad plan, right, to reshape the way that America thinks of who it is and who people are, right? Like, we have a way of thinking about like what an American is and who an American is and like what makes you a good one or not a good one that has been based on a myth. And if those ways of thinking are not addressed, then the structural inequality will remain intact in people's hearts, even if not on paper.
There's a new book, and someone can please shout out the title if I've given you enough information. It's by Richard Rothstein. And I heard a long radio interview with him, which really made me want to read it. It's just out. What it's about is that all these programs we think of having built the middle class in the United States, and that actually did build huge numbers of middle class families, were programs that, by statute, excluded African Americans.
That's right.
Right? The sort of the Federal Housing Authority, these things, it wasn't just accidental.
GI Bill.
Right? The GI Bill, all these things.
Everything. Everything in the New Deal.
It is true, everything in the New Deal. It is true that they did enormous good for enormous numbers of people. That's not a myth. It's also true that they were designed to exclude millions and millions of others, and that casts a shadow that exists till today.
Well, and I think that's a really important point. You know, something our team has really been thinking a lot about is that there are the larger societal structural issues, but you can start within your own agencies, with your own teams, and really look at your institutional practices and think about how do my practices promote equity? How do they promote equity in hiring? How do they promote equity in engagement? And really going down to the granular level of your own practices within your own organizations and institutions and critically examining those, because I think it has to happen at all levels.
Great. My name is Evan. I've worked in global health. I've done that for many years. I've also worked in the U.S. with population resource settings. But what's striking is the difference in places like India and sub-Saharan Africa, where people live in very high levels of poverty, but you don't sense a sort of despair. I mean, there's just a difference there. Has been anything we could learn in this area for the U.S. from overseas, from settings where people face horrendous challenges, but somehow it's different. It shows up differently.
I'll actually tack something onto that. Has any of this work been cross-country? So, meaning, do we know about how the neuroscience of poverty differs in India versus the United States?
I will say, I'm currently working with Sebastian Lapina, who is a cognitive neuroscientist from Argentina. We're starting a project on exactly this topic because we really don't know. It's not crazy to think that it might be quite a different beast. Scientists love parsimony, so it's like, well, why would you assume it's different? Just assume the simple thing. Except right on the face of things, the sort of limiting factors to human flourishing are quite different in sub-Saharan Africa and inner city US. So there's reason to think it's different. And yet, I will say, neuroscience is in. I'm not objecting to this. It's been very good to me. But you see, the World Bank issued a report. The Lancet series has a 3-part report on child development and poverty globally. Everybody is citing neuroscience. And really, not so fast. We
Right.
really don't know. So, good question.
I do think that relational component we've talked about, though, that strong, loving relationships, building strong, strong minds, strong bodies. I do think there is a fair amount of research across sort of cultures that is true, and so I think that is a piece that I think again, it's a thread. There's lots of threads here, but that's a thread that really does cut across.
It's also highly intuitive, and we should put
For
some
sure,
weight on
right?
intuition.
Exactly.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Asagaya. I'm with Sergo Foundation. So one thing that really stood out was the commonality between Rod Chetty's work and your work, Martha, was the neighborhood, the importance of the neighborhood. And you mentioned food and financial was not an important predictor. And Rod Chetty's work, I don't think they necessarily completely understand what aspects of the neighborhood. I mean, there's hypotheses around education and violence. Can you tell us more? What are your hypotheses around the neighborhood factors that are so important?
I really don't know. I mean, I really find this quite mysterious, and to be discovered. But I also just want to add that we found neighborhood, strong influence, maternal behavior, lesser influence, but still statistically significant. Not so much money, not so much cognitive stimulation, but that's just for the physical size of a particular piece of the brain at a particular age. So I would not look at that result and say, oh, this is great. I don't have to read to my kid because that's cognitive stimulation. He'll be fine without it, right? I mean, poverty itself in terms of income doesn't matter. So just a caution to not overinterpret, overgeneralize.
Yeah, and I want to say that one of the things that they know about the huge number of killings in Chicago is that most of the young people in Chicago don't ever leave their neighborhood. They grow up their whole lives, and they don't, in those poverty-stricken parts of Chicago, never leave their neighborhoods. And so it's like you could imagine like a human being being trapped. Their sense of vista, their sense of possibility, their sense of like hope and like difference and shift and just opening mind. I can imagine it's not like being in a literal cage, but it's like being in a cage in a sense. And so that's one of the things they're able to correlate, is that a lot of these killings and murders are coming from communities in which the young people never get to leave the communities that they are growing up in.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that when you hear social scientists talk about which variable is the strongest, they're often controlling for all the other ones.
Right.
But these variables correlate so highly, right? So that the neighborhoods with the zip codes and the census tracts with really low income have really high unemployment and have really low net worth and have really high rates of single-parent families. And so it's not as if, oh my goodness, you could see two neighborhoods that look very similar but in fact have totally different levels of these problems. They tend to really correlate quite highly. I think we have time for one more.
It's interesting. Food, education, finances, they all correlate with location, especially in America. Right. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. I did have a question. What are the biologics for the rich kids? What are their brains? How are they functioning? Have you done a baseline for them?
Yeah, not me personally, but there is research that I think that the best on this topic was done by Kim Noble, who's a former graduate student of mine. She analyzed brain scans of 1,099 children over a really wide range of socioeconomic status. And two things are very interesting. One is that the effects are graded. So it's not just sort of like there's poor people, once you're above a certain threshold, you're fine. This affects all of us, whether we're, upper middle class or upper middle, pick your terminology, which I think politically may encourage more interest in understanding and ameliorating these issues. So basically, the richest and best off kids were even further along that, dimension of big hippocampuses and so forth. But the other thing is that, so there is this gradient, but it is steeper at the lower end. So, a given increment of income or a given increment in parental education, for example, really makes so much more of a difference at that low end.
We've been given a reprieve, so we have time for a couple more questions.
cool.
But go ahead.
I was just going to, and Martha, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think also the other piece is that, right, there are, aside from poverty, when you look at other significant stresses, violence or abuse or other things that cross socioeconomic lines, those same stresses do cause some of these same changes in the brain development, right?
Yes, but not to get too nerdy and too into the weeds, we just finished an analysis of, again, hippocampus. We will eventually look at another part of the brain. And what we found is, consistent with the idea that stress impacts the hippocampus, we found that childhood poverty and childhood maltreatment, which again are correlated, but only moderately, so you can tease them apart. They both impact hippocampal volume, but different parts of the hippocampus. So childhood maltreatment impacts the head of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is called the hippocampus because it looks like a little seahorse. So the seahorse's head is affected by maltreatment, and the tail is, we don't know what that means, but it's certainly a clue that different mechanisms are involved, which is intriguing.
Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, so on the other, to the shadow side of that is then, so we then all run out, if we don't look at this as a social issue and a political issue, then what happens is then we all strive to get our kid into the better schools, or we strive to get our kids into, these more and more specialized particular education systems, whereas people that are in, those zip codes don't have those choices because the political structures don't allow for them to make those kinds of choices. And so in terms of that correlation all along the way, if we remain this hyper-individualized, oriented society, right, then what we do is we go for each of our own care, right? We say, okay, I'm going to take care of mine. I can keep moving the needle, right? Just make sure that I take care of my kids. And so that's what I was addressing in terms of the concern and the dark side. It's not about knowing, but it's what do we do if we are not shifting the way in which our society in general relates to differences in society across the board.
We, to your question about where the gradations are, the New York Times took this research where we looked at the relationship between income growing up and the chances that you finish college. And instead of just giving people the graph that showed what happened, we instead gave them an empty graph, and we asked them to guess what the relationship was. If you Google New York Times, you draw it, you can find this feature. I'm going to give it away now, I apologize. But what the overwhelming number of people who did it is they thought the relationship looked a little like an S, right? Which is what you were talking about, Martha, that it flattened out at the top. That as long as you were kind of above the 80th percentile, it didn't matter. But in fact, it is a straight diagonal line. And I don't want to suggest that a big problem in society is that the upper middle class aren't doing well enough. But it was a straight line, which is to say that within the low income group, having a little more income mattered, and within the upper income group, having a little more income mattered. And to your point, the question is, well, what do we do as a society? Do we each try to move one or two places up that line, or do we think about how we shift the whole thing? Okay, sir. Can we get a microphone here?
Hi, this will be fast, I hope.
Great.
So I'm Bryn Rubenstein. I'm a public health practitioner, whatever that means. And I feel compelled to talk about those programs that do exist, that are providing us a framework for addressing the impact of poverty or the trauma of poverty. I'm thinking nurse-family partnership or adverse childhood experiences. And what do you think neuroscience, these studies, can offer these initiatives? I think I heard empowerment was one of them, the universality of neuroscience can empower folks.
Lee, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So there's this great, you're probably familiar with it, but there's this great work that Jack Shonkoff does out of the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, and he talks a lot about this, right? It's the name of the paper is, I think, from evidence-based to breakthrough impact or something along those lines. And he talks a lot about how there are these great programs which have demonstrated effects that are good but modest. And this gets back to a little bit to what I was saying earlier, is that then he really challenges us to sort of take those things and think about what are the components that work best and when, and in what settings, and to really push ourselves and to think about different ways of evaluation, to think about different ways of implementing programs so that we're taking the base of what we know works, and then we're expanding that. I would also say that as a field, one of the things that has always frustrated me is that I think I'm one of them. I sit in an academic center in Ivory Tower and come to implementing interventions with maybe a mindset that here we come, we've got everything, we'll put it in for you and we'll run it, and then if our grant funding runs out, we'll pull back out, right? And that is not the way we need to do things. We need to co-create with our communities. We need to individualize depending on the setting. Another one of our partners, she has this great analogy, which I share with people all the time. She says, our neighborhood, our community is like a Christmas tree. She said, and people come in with their box of ornaments and they decorate the Christmas tree. And then when their funding's over or their program's over, they take the ornaments down and they leave. She said, we need to figure out a way to make the blooms blossom on the Christmas tree. And I think that's where neuroscience can take us, is to take what we know about these evidence-based programs and dive deeper and be more individualized about it.
The book you were trying to remember, the Rothstein book, is The Color of Law.
The Color of Law.
The Color of Law.
Thank you very much.
Great book. So Saul Alinsky said that people do things for the wrong reasons, find those reasons. And in policy change, that's certainly the case. Is anybody doing sort of the opportunity and real cost differential between brain development and the cost of society, which would be the ammunition you would use for policy change?
Well, I'll take that. As far as I know, nobody has applied that kind of an analysis to neuroscience or to neural measures in and of themselves. And I really neuroscience, it adds some tools to the toolbox. It doesn't replace anything. It's kind of one more thing. But there is a very interesting analysis by James Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist at the University of Chicago, who showed that if you calculate per dollar spent at a given point in somebody's, for a dollar spent helping somebody at a certain point in their life, how much money does society save? He found, not surprisingly, money spent early in life pays society back much more than money spent later in life. And depending on the, assumptions and parameters and all the voodoo that economists do, like by one model, there was a 17-fold payback to society for investments in early childhood.
I think the thing that's tricky is a lot of those investments have to be pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Right? The stuff that Heckman studied, it's not the cheap stuff, and there's huge variation in how well they do, right? Sort of the reason that Head Start, as you may have heard, doesn't have great average effects is that there are a whole bunch of really great, great Head Start programs, and then there are a bunch of bad ones. And the question is, how can we kind of get rid of the mediocre ones and do it?
Or I think, maybe not even how do we get rid of the mediocre ones, but how do we as a society come together and really invest in these programs so that we can raise the bar of those that are mediocre? Because we know the things that will make them better, right? And so how do we come together to invest and really do it across sectors in a way where we can help those who aren't doing as well, and if they can't be helped, then they can't be helped. But I think there's an element of investment there where we do know what works, but it's not easy change, and it's not change that's going to happen with a little short, you mentioned this a 2-year grant or a small amount of money. It really has to be a larger scale investment to move the needle across the board. Now, every individual change and improvement is worthwhile, and so that, not to discount that, but.
There's also then the incentive, the social incentive, because, for instance, in California, they spent $70,000 to keep young people in jail for each year.
Right.
And so what would it mean to take half of that?
Yeah.
Right, and look at how you then parse that out over the
Right.
length of 5 years of their lives to improve the conditions of where they are living.
Yep.
And so, but the question is, does that incentive exist? And so we talk about the money, but there we have an incentive towards punishment, and we don't have the same kind of incentive in our society towards healing.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite panels to moderate are the ones where I learn a lot, and this certainly qualifies. So please join me in thanking you. Thank you all for coming.